In 1763, King George III issued a proclamation that all lands west of the Appalachians were reserved for native tribes and prohibited white settlements. But bold colonists defied the law and found their way to an area in western Pennsylvania known as the Forks. Leading defiant subsistence lives, British soldiers considered these white settlers at the Forks as savage as the Indians that inhabited the West. To colonists living east of the mountains, Westerners were considered barbaric, crude, and uncivilized. As early as 1771, Western squatters had formed formal associations who escorted Pennsylvania deputies out of the area, ordering them not to return. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, British royal authority broke down in all of the colonies, but specifically west of the Alleghanies. There was an area claimed and fought over by Pennsylvania and Virginia that some locals referred to as West Sylvania. Like the independent Republic of Vermont, locals had drawn up their own constitution, and though not successful, they had attempted to secede from Pennsylvania. Such was the independent spirit of the inhabitants of western Pennsylvania. In the early American colonies, most citizens drank alcohol with meals and in between. In the cities, elite society preferred wines and brandies, but the common man's drink was rum. In western Pennsylvania, grain based whiskeys were the beverage of choice, and by the time of the American Revolution, whiskey was gaining in popularity. It was well known that the best whiskey came from the forks of the Ohio, and Monongahela rye had achieved brand recognition across the colonies. Locally, a gallon of whiskey sold for about 25 cents, but east of the mountains, it brought 2 to 4 times that price. Transporting rye grain was economically unfeasible compared to transporting whiskey. Valued in all communities, whiskey became a currency of sorts that was accepted anywhere in the colonies, but especially in the West, where gold and silver coin was scarce. Distilling mostly took place on small farms, and there were few large scale commercial operations. Americans drank alcoholic beverages in large quantities, and distilling was a crucial part of the fledgling nation's economy. Located about 20 miles south of the Forks was the Mingo Creek Church. Not actually used as a church since well before the Revolutionary War, the building served as the meeting place for the Mingo Creek Association, where community efforts and politics were discussed. Two of the leading voices in the association were brothers John and Daniel Hamilton. Both were local landowners and Revolutionary War veterans. John was a commander of the local militia and sheriff of Washington County. They would both be prominent figures in the upcoming rebellion. In 1789, George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States and resided in the Capitol in Philadelphia. In those post revolutionary years, the federal government owed 54 million in war debt, and the combined states owed another 25 million. Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was tasked with a plan to pay off this debt to foreign and domestic bondholders. Hamilton proposed a variety of taxes, which included an excise tax on domestically distilled spirits. A portion of the legislature were vehemently opposed to the whiskey tax because it was like the excise taxes that Britain had imposed on the colonies, which had led to the Revolutionary War. Both legislators and common citizens were not opposed to paying off the war debt. What they were opposed to were what they called unequal taxes. Everyone quickly realized that these new tax revenues would end up in the pockets of the bondholders, and that common citizens would struggle under the tax burden. Though most understood the general concept of Hamilton's plan, only a small group of insiders fully understood the details behind the scenes. Most of the domestic bonds were held by a small group of wealthy men, who were the very men who embraced Hamilton's plan and were most outspoken in supporting it in Congress. If the revenues were collected on the new whiskey tax, these Philadelphia insiders would stand to cash in their war bonds at huge profits. Hamilton's whiskey tax caused a furor among both legislators and citizens and would eventually lead to civil unrest. After heated debate, on March 3, 1791, the U.S. House passed the so-called whiskey tax by a margin of 35 to 21. Since declaring independence from Britain, this was the first time that a tax had been placed on an American product. In pre-colonial Europe and colonial America, commoners had protested such taxes as unfair. For many, when the legislature in Philadelphia passed the whiskey tax, it was a glaring statement that the new government was going to impose the same type of unfair taxes that had ignited the Revolutionary War. The way that the law was written, it did a poor job of explaining exactly how the taxes would be collected. It stated that the tax would be collected by federal officers in coin where it was produced. Coin was scarce in the West, where barter was far more common, but no provisions for barter were made. Failure to pay would deprive the manufacturer of the government tax stamp, which would allow confiscation by law if transported. Failure to register a still was punishable by a cash fine of $150, which exceeded most citizens' annual income, and the stills themselves could be seized. Deputy inspectors were assigned to each county, whose duty was to collect the registration fees and place a registration mark upon the still. After the duty was collected, the deputy would issue a certificate stamped with a Treasury Department seal, which made the product legal. All of this sounded very proper and legal on paper, but few producers in the West had any gold or silver coin with which to pay the tax. The man appointed to collect the whiskey tax in western Pennsylvania was General John Neville. He lived on a 10,000-acre plantation called Bower Hill. At a time when it was considered a luxury to own one cow or one horse, Neville owned 10 horses, 16 head of cattle, and 23 sheep, and he owned 18 slaves. Slavery was not illegal or unknown in the state of Pennsylvania, but it was not common, and the fact that he owned slaves stood out. The Neville family were well connected in local business and politics. Neville's son, Presley, owned a large brick house in Pittsburgh and a country residence. Neville's son-in-law, Isaac Craig, was the deputy quartermaster for the troops garrisoned at Pittsburgh, a lucrative position for a family in the business of providing supplies to the military. Neville's brother-in-law, Major Kirkpatrick, ran the military commissary at Fort Lafayette. The Nevilles were well positioned to profit from sales to the military. One of the most important commodities that they sold was whiskey, and they would be able to monopolize those sales if the new laws made non-registered whiskey illegal. County sheriffs, who were the actual enforcers of the law, were consistently among the wealthiest members of any community. To the common citizens, the new law was obviously a conspiracy of wealth and power, and those enforcing it were greatly resented. And locals also saw how the law benefited the Nevilles. The Nevilles distillery operated at a capacity of over 600 gallons. The way the law was written, it benefited big operators who paid a flat tax, and the Nevilles were slowly gaining a monopoly on sales to the army. Despite his wealth, General Neville had been popular among the locals, but in the spring of 1791, when he had been appointed as revenue inspector, his popularity began to wane. The largest local distiller, who benefited from the inequity of the law, was appointed to collect the tax from those who were burdened with the inequality. As a tax enforcer, Neville would draw not only an annual salary of $450, twice most families' annual income, but also a 1% commission on what he collected from his neighbors. Neville had first railed against the new law, but suddenly he changed his mind and took the collection job. Everyone at the Forks could see the obvious corruption. In the fall of 1791, groups of men from various democratic associations in the western frontier began attacking collectors of the whiskey tax. With either blackened faces or streaked with Indian war paint, men stripped down to just deerskin pants and imitated native raiding parties. And so, on one night in September 1791, members of the Mingo Creek Association set out to seek local tax collectors. Robert Johnson had been appointed as the whiskey tax collector for Washington County. He was in a desolate part of the forest a few miles southeast of Mingo Creek when he found the road blocked by a gang of armed men. Johnson was a dim-witted man, but even he could tell that the men were white settlers dressed in Indian garb. Frequently, encounters like this were merely ritual humiliations where victims were left fully clothed. But on that night, the association administered a less gentle version. Johnson was stripped naked and his hair shorn with hunting knives close to the skull. Hot tar was applied to his naked body, searing the skin. Johnson was not the smartest of men, which probably contributed to him taking a job of which he may not have fully understood the risks. But dim-witted as he may have been, he still recognized two of the attackers as his neighbors, John and Daniel Hamilton. Johnson did survive, and after a painful process of removing the tar, it left no permanent damage. But due to the humiliation, he immediately resigned his position as tax collector. Eventually, he swore out a complaint which brought the names of John and Daniel Hamilton to the attention of the federal government back in Philadelphia. Hugh Henry Brackenridge was a lawyer who came to Pittsburgh in 1781. In 1786, he helped to establish the first newspaper west of the Alleghanies, the Pittsburgh Gazette. That same year, he was elected to the Pennsylvania State Assembly. He became embroiled in the West Sylvania dispute, siding with those who opposed admitting Western Pennsylvania as the 14th state, and he strongly supported ratifying the new federal constitution, both of which diminished his popularity with some of his Pittsburgh neighbors. He was the most cultivated man in Pittsburgh, where he lived in the biggest brick mansion in town, and he would come to play an important role in the Whiskey Rebellion. On September 7, 1791, the day after Robert Johnson had been tarred and feathered, John and Daniel Hamilton attended a meeting at the Sign of the Green Tree Tavern in Pittsburgh. The conference was attended by local civic leaders, including Mr. Brackenridge and General Neville. It was mostly a gathering of moderates who were concerned about their financial interests, but were also determined to work peacefully within the new federal and state governments. They didn't want to attack anyone, they just wanted their new government to function in a just manner. The moderates were mostly wealthy men who may have had political ambitions, but not all of those present were moderates. John Hamilton, who was more emotionally stable than his quick-tempered brother Daniel, was also a well-respected member of the Washington County community. Though most attendees did not know it, John Hamilton had been present at the tar and feathering of Robert Johnson the night before. News of this incident had found its way to the conference and was interpreted that the tax would not be tolerated, and when John Hamilton spoke, he left no doubt where he stood. Hamilton and Brackenridge got into a heated debate over what actions should take place. Brackenridge urged patience and petitions to change the law. John Hamilton said that local associations in the western counties had determined that the law was unjust and that it was the duty of every citizen to resist the tax law. The stage was being set for a conflict between the moderates and the radicals. The moderates were men of wealth who could afford to be patient. The radicals were subsistence farmers who saw the whiskey tax as a financial threat to their livelihoods and who wanted quick action and swift results. It took some time to find a sheriff who would assist him, but eventually Robert Johnson swore out a formal complaint naming Daniel Hamilton as an assailant who had attacked him. Local authorities took no action, but the document made its way to the federal government in Philadelphia, which resulted in a federal marshal being assigned as a process server. In October of 1791, Federal Marshal Joseph Fox arrived in Allegheny County to serve warrants on federal charges to several suspects in the Robert Johnson case. Traveling alone, Fox knew that it was a risky task to serve processes for attacking a federal officer like himself. His first destination was General Neville's plantation. Neville agreed that Fox's life was in danger and advised him to send the warrants by proxy by a man named John Connor. Locals considered John Connor to be a dim-witted and possibly senile man. Marshal Fox quickly agreed. The warrants were given to Connor, who was instructed to serve them to Daniel Hamilton and others named. When rumor spread in advance that Connor was coming to serve warrants, Daniel Hamilton and fellow members of the Mingo Creek Association prepared. When Connor encountered his first gang of Western radicals, they took him into the woods where his body was stripped naked, he was horsewhipped, and tarred and feathered. His horse, money, and all the warrants were taken. When Marshal Fox heard what happened, he quickly departed for Philadelphia. For the remainder of 1791, no warrants were issued and no whiskey taxes were collected, but General Neville sent a list of grievances to the Treasury Department in Philadelphia concerning local resistance to the tax law. He asserted that only an armed force would have the ability to collect the federal whiskey tax. The Green Tree Tavern petition had failed to make any impact on Eastern lawmakers. In the spring of 1792, Mr. Brackenridge traveled to Philadelphia to represent Western grievances. He had limited success in persuading Eastern politicians that the new whiskey tax was unjust, but he did notice that the politically affluent men in Philadelphia were dividing into factions. Thomas Jefferson opposed the policies of Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton, and with Madison, they created the Democratic-Republican Party. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams were the most important leaders of the Federalist Party, which was a coalition of bankers and businessmen who supported Hamilton's economic policies, including the whiskey tax. Brackenridge saw the Federalists as representing bankers and businessmen, and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans claiming to represent the commoners. But the clash between Hamilton and Jefferson and the controversy between the two emerging parties was not concerned with the powerful versus the commoners, but between rival economic systems, each of which would benefit the men of property in each party. Each faction idealized themselves while condemning the ethics of the others. And it was in the confusion of these emerging parties that Hamilton revised the whiskey tax law. When the revised law was passed, none of the changes benefited the small producers. Big distillers took advantage of the new law and chose to pay based on capacity. As their production numbers increased, their tax rate decreased. Small producers couldn't take advantage of the per capacity option and subsequently paid a higher tax rate. Many concluded that Hamilton's goal wasn't fairer taxes, but a process where taxes were easier to enforce and collect. Small distillers were now required to register their stills with collection officers. Anyone failing to register could have their still impounded and be fined $250, nearly twice most citizens' annual income. The new law was a devastating blow to the Western economy. In the early summer of 1792, no one in Western Pennsylvania attempted to enforce the law. In June, Kentucky was admitted as the 15th state, but not one penny of whiskey taxes was collected there. The small amount of taxes collected in Pennsylvania, Georgia, and the Carolinas was less than the cost of enforcing the law. And there was a marked increase in whiskey smuggling. Whiskey was being smuggled out of Pennsylvania down the Ohio River to Kentucky and beyond. Producers were willing to sell for as low as 25 cents a gallon just so they didn't have to pay the tax. With most citizens circumventing the new tax law, civil unrest mostly died out in the western frontier. In July of 1792, General Neville ran an ad in the Pittsburgh Gazette to rent a space for the excise tax registration office. Washington County citizens were reluctant to answer Neville's ad, but he did get one interested party. William Faulkner from the town of Washington owned a building where he lived with his wife, which also housed a small tavern and an additional room which he offered to Neville. Members of the Mingo Creek Association visited Faulkner and politely insisted he not rent the room to Neville. Faulkner disregarded their advice. General Neville ran a second ad informing all distillers in the county to report to his new office to register their stills. The first tax collection office west of the Alleghenies was officially open for business. In the following days, Daniel Hamilton visited Faulkner's tavern and ordered him to evict Neville. Daniel Hamilton made it clear that Faulkner would be tarred and feathered and his home would be destroyed, but Faulkner foolishly refused to be intimidated. Within days, the Mingo Creek Association tore down the tax office sign, battered down the door, and destroyed most of its contents, but left the building standing. The next day, Faulkner evicted Neville. Over the next 2 years, sporadic acts of violence against anyone attempting to enforce the law meant that few revenues were ever collected in and around the forks. To Easterners, the West was a lawless frontier where anarchy reigned. To Alexander Hamilton, they were like spoiled children, eager to reap the benefits of their new nation, but unwilling to pay their fair share. And to President Washington, the lawlessness in and around the forks was a political cauldron that brought financial instability to the 60,000 acres of land he owned west of the Alleghenies. In June of 1794, General Neville placed another ad in the Pittsburgh Gazette where he published the names and addresses of all the tax collectors in the 4 western counties and demanded that all residents register their stills no later than June 30. The Mingo Creek Association sent out squadrons of men to each of the addresses. Tax collectors' homes had windows broken out, outbuildings and crops burnt, and some less fortunate victims were tarred and feathered. When June 30 arrived, not one penny of whiskey tax had been collected, and most collectors had quit their jobs. In June of 1794, when Alexander Hamilton assigned U.S. Marshal David Lennox to ride west and issue summonses to all delinquent distillers, it was the spark that ignited the series of events that would become known as the Whiskey Rebellion. General Neville accompanied Marshal Lennox as he served writs to local farmers. News of Lennox's presence soon spread, and a posse of local militiamen started tracking them at a distance. When they arrived at William Miller's farm, Lennox issued a summons and a $250 fine. Miller, who was cousins with Neville's brother-in-law, was confused how he could be in violation and angry that Neville had purposely led Lennox to his farm. As the two men got into a heated argument, Neville noticed the posse emerging from the woods and galloped away to the safety of his fortified mansion atop Bower Hill, and Lennox rode north to Pittsburgh. News of Marshal Lennox's presence made its way to the Mingo Creek Association, where plans were made to force Lennox to hand over his summonses. Assuming he was with Neville at Bower Hill, members of the association set out to arrest Lennox. When the posse arrived, they found the main house was barricaded with thick planks. The posse identified themselves as the Guard of Washington County and demanded that Marshal Lennox turn over his writs. Neville did not answer, but fired upon the men, and his first bullet struck William Miller's nephew Oliver. The boy went down, and the wound would prove to be fatal. There was a further exchange of gunfire, with General Neville wounding 4 more men before they retreated 4 miles south to Couch's Ford. Neville sent a rider to Pittsburgh to summon his son Presley. Presley went to the law office of Mr. Brackenridge and demanded that he muster the Pittsburgh militia to defend Bower Hill. Brackenridge's advice was that Neville and Lennox should turn over the writs to the posse and defuse the situation and let the courts sort out the legal actions later. Presley insisted that the local militia be mustered, but Brackenridge responded that the superior numbered rebels could easily defeat the small local militia, and they might sack the town of Pittsburgh, which could lead to the Federal Army coming from Philadelphia. Brackenridge volunteered to ride out to Couch's Ford and reason with them, but what he didn't know was that a detachment of soldiers led by Neville's brother-in-law, Major Kirkpatrick, had departed Fort Lafayette bound for Bower Hill. Eventually, over 600 men from the Mingo Creek Association joined the posse at Couch's Fort. Though scouts had informed them that Major Kirkpatrick was bringing a force of United States Army to defend Bower Hill, the rebel militia voted to march to the plantation, make a show of force, and demand that Marshal Lennox hand over his writs and General Neville resign as excise inspector. This was no night raid by men disguised in blackface. This was a group of citizens with no authority other than their own informal association embarking on an armed military action against the U.S. Army. When John Hamilton, sheriff of Washington County, addressed the militia, he acknowledged that the vote had been taken to march on Bower Hill, but that he would not be joining them. With Hamilton stepping down, they nominated Major James McFarland to assume command. Meanwhile, at Bower Hill, the U.S. troops led by Kirkpatrick arrived ahead of the posse and took cover inside the fortified mansion. General Neville positioned himself in a ravine south of the house to observe. About 600 militiamen arrived. Major McFarland found some high ground from which to command, and the posse drilled in front of the mansion. They demanded that Lennox turn over his writs, and Kirkpatrick insisted that neither Neville nor Lennox were there. Some militiamen grew impatient and set fire to some outbuildings, and then a lengthy exchange of gunfire took place. It was at this time that Presley Neville and Marshal Lennox arrived at the militia's rear. Showing little common sense, Presley shouted, "If any of you is a gentleman, come out and speak to me." Marshal Lennox cringed at Presley's impractical words, and immediately they were taken under guard. Then a white flag waved from the front of the mansion, and the gunfire started to subside. Major McFarland strode forward, shouting for a ceasefire. He had barely spoken when one single shot was fired, and McFarland was hit in the groin, fell to the ground, quickly bled out, and died. The rebels connected the flag of truce with the shot that had killed McFarland and resumed firing and lit more outbuildings on fire. With the flames moving toward the main house, Kirkpatrick surrendered. They then set the mansion and crops on fire and stampeded the livestock. General Neville watched from the ravine as most of the buildings from his plantation went up in flames. In one day, he and his wife went from the wealthiest settlers west of the Alleghanies to owning nothing but the clothes on their backs. The posse dismissed the U.S. troops, but Kirkpatrick, Presley Neville, and Marshal Lennox were seized by the militiamen. Lennox swore that he would serve no more writs west of the Allegheny Mountains. They were escorted under guard to Pittsburgh and released. The Neville family went into hiding at their relatives, the Craigs. Neville's son-in-law, Isaac Craig, wrote a letter to Secretary of War Henry Knox describing the rebel insurrection and pleading for assistance from the federal government. James McFarland was interred across the road from the Mingo Creek Church. Hundreds attended the funeral, and in the following days, the Mingo Creek Association met and deliberated on their next actions. There were many members of the Mingo Creek Association that wanted to burn the entire town of Pittsburgh, but more diplomatic members prevailed, and a delegation was sent to collect the warrants that Lennox had already served, and to demand General Neville's resignation. If their demands were met, Pittsburgh would be spared. Many local civil leaders insisted that Neville and Lennox surrender to save the town, and both sides agreed that a meeting would take place in Mr. Brackenridge's law office. When the two sides met, the general wrote out his resignation, which, in contemptuous language, included his own demands. The rebels were fretting over trivialities, and Mr. Brackenridge recognized that both sides were too biased to realize the folly of their own demands. Privately, he understood that the rebels were most likely guilty of the capital crime of treason. He knew that if he warned the rebels that their actions could result in them being hanged, it might be the catalyst that would ignite their wrath. He also knew that if he advised Neville and Lennox to give up their legal documents to save Pittsburgh from being burned, this could later be seen as siding with the rebels, and he could hang along with them. To please both sides and to save his own hide, Brackenridge wrote a document full of confusing circular logic that fundamentally said nothing. Both sides refused to sign, and Brackenridge accompanied the delegation out of town. While they were gone, Neville, Lennox, and a small escort of U.S. Army soldiers secretly boarded a raft and set out west on the Ohio River. He left behind his wife and extended family and accepted that escaping to Kentucky was his best bet for saving his own life. Brackenridge attended a large meeting at the Mingo Creek Church. Radicals spoke in support of the attack on Bower Hill and the arrest of Neville and Lennox. Brackenridge cautiously advised them that the burning of Bower Hill might have been morally right, but legally it was wrong. He continued that under the Militia Act, the burning of the private property of an authorized representative of the law could be seen as treason, and the President of the United States was now empowered to mobilize a detachment of the U.S. Army against them. Brackenridge saw utter amazement on the faces around him. Most locals didn't realize the repercussions of their own actions. Since the Shays Rebellion, the new federal government had come into existence specifically to deal with such non-legally sanctioned bodies. Then he suggested that anyone that had not been involved in the attack write a petition asking the president for amnesty for those who were involved. He saw shock and anger on many faces around him. He asked that they think about his proposal while he excused himself for some fresh air. Once outside of the building, he quickly rode north to Pittsburgh. In the following days, Brackenridge's words were mostly forgotten. Local militia commanders gathered their troops, not understanding that only the governor could muster local militias, and that their actions usurped military authority. The result was a region wide force that dwarfed the troops that had burnt Bower Hill. They were to converge at Braddock's Field, about 10 miles east of Pittsburgh. The goal was to attack the garrison at Fort Lafayette and seize the military munitions to defend the western country against the oppressive federal government. By mid afternoon of the next day, battalions from the western counties had converged at Braddock's Field. They numbered nearly 7,000. Jugs of whiskey were being passed, and the constant sound of musket fire into the air was deafening. Mr. Brackenridge arrived with the Pittsburgh militia as a show of support, but also to act as moderator. The radicals were adamant that they should march on the town of Pittsburgh. Brackenridge jovially agreed, saying they should march through town, displaying a show of force, enjoy some whiskey, compliments of the townsfolk, and then exit across the river. The Pittsburgh militia marched well in advance to prepare the townsfolk for what was coming. They closed all the taverns, opened barrels of whiskey, and prepared rafts to ferry the rebels across the river. Brackenridge rode at the head of the main force and purposely took the south road away from the fort and led the rebels to an open plain on the south edge of town where locals met them with barrels of whiskey. Brackenridge called it a glorious revolution without bloodshed. The idea of burning Pittsburgh to the ground slowly evaporated. Many ferried or forded the river southbound for home, and by nightfall there were less than 200 men left in town. In the wake of the gathering at Braddock's Field, politics dominated discussions in the Forks. While Westerners were consumed with local rebel politics, powerful men were meeting in Philadelphia with their own agenda. On July 25, 1794, Secretary of War Henry Knox received the letter from Isaac Craig describing the burning of Bower Hill. Then President Washington's cabinet received reports of General Neville fleeing westward to Kentucky, the mob of 7,000 marching on Pittsburgh, and the extra-legal congresses being held in western counties. Washington's administration agreed that the rule of law had broken down in western Pennsylvania. To exercise his powers as described in the Militia Act, all the president needed was certification by a Supreme Court justice that officials had failed to enforce the law, which justified federal military force. Alexander Hamilton approached Supreme Court Justice James Wilson, who was an ally of the bankers who had speculated in government bonds and served to profit from the whiskey tax. Wilson provided the necessary documents for Washington to muster federal troops. On August 5, Hamilton submitted his report to Washington, stating that the rebellion was a military action, not a criminal action, and justified sending federal troops. After reviewing Hamilton's report, the cabinet split in two, with only half supporting his position. Secretary of State Edmund Randolph asked Washington to be patient and attempt to negotiate with the rebels. Hamilton and Knox wanted to act immediately, sending a force of at least 12,000 troops. Attorney General William Bradford suggested a covert operation where a peace commission would be sent as political cover, drawing attention away from the fact that they would be mobilizing troops to put down the rebellion. On August 6, Washington proposed a compromise. Attorney General Bradford would lead a peace commission to negotiate with the rebels, while Hamilton and Knox would prepare to mobilize troops. On August 7, the peace commission set out for the Forks, but that same day, as required by the Militia Act, Washington issued a proclamation that ordered insurgents to disperse, threatening to use federal troops if they did not. Also that same day, Knox sent requests to the governors of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland, and Virginia, asking for a total of 13,000 militiamen to be held in reserves if needed. Soon afterwards, Knox was given permission by Washington to leave Philadelphia to attend to some land investments in Maine. While Knox was gone, Hamilton stepped in to cover the duties of the Secretary of War. Soon after, the governors of Maryland, Virginia, and New Jersey responded to Knox's request, but it was Hamilton, the author of the tax law, who now coordinated several state militias for the purpose of enforcing his whiskey tax. On August 15, Bradford arrived at the Congress being held at the Forks. While he was negotiating with the rebels, Bradford was also sending letters to President Washington containing a substantial amount of military intelligence, including quantities of ammunition, bayonets, rifles, muskets, cannon, powder, and troops. Armed with Bradford's reports, Alexander Hamilton stepped up his duties as Secretary of War and began ordering troops and supplies. With President Washington commanding 13,000 troops in the East, news quickly made its way to the western frontier. Mr. Brackenridge attended a meeting at Domingo Creek Church and informed the association that Washington was bringing an army west to force locals to abide by the excise tax. He also informed them that the Peace Commission was offering an amnesty and the military threat could be avoided if local citizens would sign a loyalty oath. The oath read, "I do solemnly promise henceforth to submit to the laws of the United States, that I will not, directly or indirectly, oppose the execution of the acts for raising a revenue on distilled spirits and stills, and that I will support, as far as the law requires, the civil authority in affording the protection due to all officers and other citizens." By October 9, 1794, President Washington, commanding a force of 13,000 federal troops, had traveled half the distance from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Though Hamilton was never officially confirmed by the Senate to the position, he was acting as Secretary of War. When news of the troops arrived at the Forks, local radicals were demoralized. To avoid capture by the army, many rebels departed westward on the Ohio River to Kentucky. The Pittsburgh Town Committee, which had expelled General Neville, repealed the expulsion and officially announced the rebellion was at an end. Washington's army might arrive completely unopposed. The Federal Army was made up of two classes. Officers were young volunteers from the Eastern aristocracy. Their uniforms were of gorgeous color and fabric, and they rode the finest mounts most men had ever seen. Hyped on the patriotism they had read in Eastern newspapers, they volunteered under conditions of rank and what officers they would serve, and if their demands were not met, many refused to serve. The rank and file soldiers were mostly militia draftees. If one could afford it, draftees hired substitutes to serve in their place. So, the ranks were mostly filled with poor laborers and recent immigrants. They had no uniforms and were ill prepared for the cooler fall weather. Militia supplies were thin. Tents, coats, and even blankets were scarce. Soldiers slept in bare fields, while officers slept in warm taverns and homes. Desertion was rampant, and every morning began with floggings. What was supposed to be a patriotic army wanting to suppress rebellious traitors was in fact a bunch of undernourished, poorly clothed, angry men who were eager to find any way out of serving. The splendidly dressed officers spent much of their time hunting down deserters who were then beaten in front of their demoralized comrades. Then, on October 21, Washington called a council of his generals. They were given orders on how the campaign was to be conducted, after which Washington climbed into his carriage and headed east for Philadelphia, leaving Hamilton in charge. Over the next days, the 13,000 troops were cold and hungry as they strung out over many miles on their march westward. While local families hid inside of their farmhouses, desperate soldiers trampled through unharvested fields, tore down fences for firewood, and stole pigs and chickens for food. Washington had left orders that officers were to flog any man caught stealing, but Hamilton knew that supplies were thin and countermanded that order. He basically made theft legal, announcing that the quartermaster had the right to impress civilian property. Families looked on helplessly as soldiers confiscated valuable grain, meat, firewood, and blankets in the name of the U.S. government. For many locals, a cold, hard winter was coming. Before Hamilton's army arrived, more than 2,000 locals had fled westward on the Ohio River. A few, like Daniel Hamilton, who had committed an act of terror, were already gone. The only people remaining were those who were certain they had committed no crime and were protected by amnesty. And then came what the people of the Forks would come to call the dreadful night. Alexander Hamilton had compiled 3 lists. First contained those given amnesty. Second contained those marked for arrest. And the third were witnesses to give testimony. He knew that the Mingo Creek Association was the source of the rebel activity and where the most valuable information would be acquired. Hamilton sent a man known as Blackbeard White to arrest anyone at the Mingo Creek Church. About 40 men, including Sheriff John Hamilton, were arrested and brought to a temporary jail whose log walls had not been chinked and its cellar floor was mud. The prisoners were tied back to back and forced to sit in the icy mud of the cellar. Blackbeard White told the guards that the prisoners were to receive no food or drink. For 2 days, the near-freezing prisoners were starved. After the guards expressed concern that the men might die, Blackbeard White marched them 12 miles to the town of Washington, where they were held without charge until Alexander Hamilton's tribunal could question them. When they were finally interrogated, all of them were released on lack of evidence, except John Hamilton, who was detained. After the dreadful night, arrests went on throughout the 4 counties. The brutality of the arrests and the torture of the prisoners were powerful tools of persuasion to discourage anyone from participating in any act of resistance. Federal Judge Richard Peters oversaw prosecuting any prisoners that had not been released. The large number of arrests required him to review cases quickly. He held about 20 men, including Sheriff John Hamilton, to be transferred east even though there was no evidence against them. Locals resented Alexander Hamilton, and when he departed the Forks, he requested an escort of 6 soldiers on horseback. Before his departure, he chose the Philadelphia Horse Guard to escort the prisoners east. They were striking equestrians wearing blue uniforms and riding perfectly matched bay horses. They were a sight to behold by anyone in Philadelphia, but here in the impoverished West, they were an eerily strange presence. With their swords pointing upward, between each pair of guards rode a pair of ragged prisoners. Starved and cold, the prisoners rode horses of every shape and color, some on saddles, some bareback, some on threadbare blankets. Locals watched in astonishment as their brethren were escorted east over the mountains to what fate no one knew. It was an arduous journey over the mountains, with captives suffering horrible abuse at the hands of the guards. They reached Philadelphia on Christmas Day. The prisoners wore the appearance of wretchedness. The triumphant army paraded the prisoners down Broad Street to cheers of the people and the sound of artillery. A band played as the wretched procession passed the president's house, and the great man came out to bask in the glory of the moment. One newspaper said, "The father of his country expresses more in his countenance than can be described." The prisoners were jailed where they languished for months. These 20 obscure prisoners were going to shoulder the blame for all the events that became known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Sheriff John Hamilton was the most prominent name among them, but had not had much involvement in the preceding months. Most were just poor farmers. The others owned no land at all. Two of the prisoners were described as simple-minded and certainly incapable of organizing a revolt to overthrow the U.S. government. One farmer was poor enough that he could not afford a still. Another owned nothing at all. In the end, there simply wasn't any evidence against any of them. The army had failed to capture anyone that was a true leader. But Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and the Eastern citizens required symbols of their victory over the rebels, and scapegoats would be found. Only 12 cases went to trial, and only 2 were convicted of treason. One was the simple-minded farmer, and one was the man who owned nothing. Newspapers issued glorious stories of the impending execution of these treasonous traitors. Eventually, both were pardoned by President Washington. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans were vocally critical of Hamilton's use of military force. In the pro-Jefferson newspaper, the Aurora, they called Hamilton a military despot, implying that his recent ascension to military general was but a first step toward a deep-laid scheme, not for the promotion of the country's prosperity, but the advancement of his private interests. James Madison insisted that the Whiskey Rebellion was being exploited to establish the principle that a standing army was necessary for enforcing the laws. Jefferson conjectured that an insurrection was announced and proclaimed and armed against, but could never be found. General Neville returned to Pittsburgh and started rebuilding his businesses and was formally authorized as enforcer of the excise tax. Yet the whiskey tax remained difficult for anyone to collect. In fact, collection costs exceeded revenues collected. The main result was that the whiskey trade went underground in the form of moonshining and smuggling. The authority that Hamilton had so forcibly established in western Pennsylvania wasn't challenged, it was merely eluded. If you enjoyed this documentary and are interested in a more in-depth analysis of the Whiskey Rebellion, including the eventual financial collapse of the Eastern bondholders and the whiskey tax's contribution to Thomas Jefferson's election as president in 1800, then consider seeking out my book, Rebellion, a 300-year saga of one family's struggle with authority, the Shays Rebellion, the Whiskey Rebellion, New Orleans, Storyville, Pendergast's Kansas City, the Haight-Ashbury, and beyond.